Hello, welcome to Lecture 5, Anarchism in Europe and the U.S. The focus of this lecture really is on U.S. rather than Europe. Given the limits of time, I think it's important for you to understand what the historical background and terrorist background of anarchism in the United States, particularly at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. So what is anarchism? Well, no doubt many, if not most of you, have seen the anarchist symbol here shown on the left, perhaps spray painted on a wall or embroidered on a backpack or scrawled in Sharpie on a toilet stall. But what is anarchism really? What does it mean? Well, at its root level, in terms of the origin of the word, anarchy comes from the Greek on, without, and archos, ruler. So anarchy in English means without rulers or without government. At its root, then, anarchism owes a great deal to Enlightenment thought that we discussed in reference to the French Revolution, especially the notion expounded by Rousseau that freedom is a morally central concept to human existence. Thus, anarchists are those who believe that the state should not exist. I want to stress here that there are many categories of anarchism, as many different forms practically as there are practitioners of anarchy. Some anarchists believe that human beings are essentially good and that, even without the state, we would be able to create a functioning society that people would want to live in. Other anarchists believe in a limited state structure, a very small government charged by the collective group of people to do certain tasks on their behalf, but nothing like socialist or communist anarchists, who saw that government would essentially be a collective controlled by a single class group, for example the proletariat, and that goods would be held in common. Some consider Josiah Warren, shown here on the left, to be the first American anarchist. Warren believed in a kind of anarchism with private property. He rejected communist notions of communal property. In Warren's view, individuals controlled their private property but cooperated and voluntarily decided to form communities. Communities were self-governing by consent. There was no compulsion by force. Warren's ideas had far-reaching influence in Europe. His own ideas were perhaps influenced in part by English anarchist thinker William Godwin, who by many is considered the father of anarchism. Godwin, an atheist, believed in the perfectibility of humanity and in the potential of a utopian future. He was not, however, a proponent of political violence. Europe, in fact, was to be the greatest hotbed of anarchist thought in the 19th century. The spread of revolutionary and anarchist ideas depended on a number of factors, chief among these the industrialization of Europe. Along with industrialization came the vast movement of people from the countryside to crowd the cities, where the exchange of ideas was facilitated by the density of the populations of urban slums, cafes, and social gatherings. We are here living in a world of Victorian-era brick cities, covered in the black grime of industry, where people lived in crowded squalor, some searching for humanity and dignity in the most inhumane and undignified conditions, others daring for even greater things, revolution and the end of the capitalist system, the end of classes, the end of artificial distinction, and the advent of utopia. Anarchist groups in Europe were especially active in Russia. Some of the foremost anarchist thinkers and activists, such as Peter Kropotkin, shown here, 1842 to 1921, was a Russian aristocrat who espoused ideas that humans were not dominated by competition, but rather were often driven by mutual cooperation, and that such cooperation in a non-coercive society, that people could exist without private property, without the state, without the church, and without capitalism. Russian anarchists called Narodnaya Volya, the people's will, murdered Tsar Alexander II in 1881, during which time Kropotkin was living in Switzerland. After the murder of the Tsar, Kropotkin was ejected from Switzerland, moved to Paris, where he was arrested and eventually settled in London, returning to Russia during the Revolution of 1917. Kropotkin was bitterly disappointed when the Bolsheviks took power because, as he knew, this meant the triumph of absolutism over libertarian ideas. Yes, libertarian ideas today in the U.S. are probably the closest thing we have to organized anarchists. Most American libertarians, however, unlike their European ancestors, are not opponents of capitalism. In the U.S., anarchism found especially fruitful soil in which to seed itself due to the upheavals the country experienced after the American Civil War. Although the North had been largely industrializing before the war, the post-war decades saw deeper growth of factories and especially connections of the centers of recovery of raw materials, factories, and markets via the railroad. This was the so-called Gilded Age, when capitalism ran rife and the mass of common people were either victims of or bystanders to the unrestrained flood of capitalist enterprises. In the U.S., anarchism blossomed, especially in the labor movements surrounding the railroads between 1868 and 1877, when 33,000 miles of new railroad track was laid. But in 1873, the bubble burst. A combination of speculative investments, monetary crisis, post-war inflation, and the abandonment of the silver standard by Germany led to an economic depression that lasted from 1873 to 79. In 1877, a massive railroad strike by workers in the U.S. was broken up by federal troops. Labor issues were constantly on the simmer. During most of the Gilded Age, however, the growth of cities, mining, smelting, and other heavy industries proceeded apace with virtually no regulation and no safety for workers. A good example of working conditions during this time is that typical of coal miners in Pennsylvania or West Virginia or Kentucky. Miners were paid by the ton of coal that they produced. They worked until exhaustion, not by the hour. They suffered from black lung and other respiratory and chronic conditions. They worked underground with no safety equipment in 3 to 5 foot high tunnels where the circulation of air was poor, the heat was stifling, and danger everywhere. There were no limits to the workday, no pensions, no standards, and no care for workers. One major moment in the conflict between labor and capitalism was the Haymarket Affair. On May 4, 1886, following tense May celebrations, and of course May Day, the 1st of May, had been adopted as a universal day celebrating the working man, about 3,000 workers showed up to demonstrations in Haymarket Square in Chicago. Adding to the tension was the ongoing strike at the McCormick Harvester Machine Company, run by the descendants of Cyrus McCormick, and these had turned bitter. The company had brought in strikebreakers under police guard against union men who had fought for an 8-hour workday. Pinkerton detectives, a kind of ancestor to a Blackwater Security Company or other private mercenary outfits, used coercion and force to intimidate workers. 2 workers had been killed by police gunfire on May 3rd, a move that union workers saw as a clear expression of a police-industry alliance and the collusion of the police in the murder of innocent union workers. August Spiess, one of those present at Haymarket on the 4th of May, 1886, was the editor of the Arbeiter Zeitung, the Workers' Daily, a German-language labor movement daily newspaper in Chicago. He was speaking when, at 10:30 p.m., Chicago Police Inspector Bonfield ordered the crowd to disperse. The police formed a line, which some of those gathered interpreted as an aggressive act. Someone from among the union men collected at Haymarket threw a homemade dynamite bomb at the police line. One policeman, Matthias Deegan, was killed instantly, and 6 others were fatally wounded. In all, about 60 police officers were wounded. In the aftermath of Haymarket, anarchist agitators and union supporters were rounded up. Many had nothing to do with Haymarket, and they were not even present that night. Shocking. In one of the only times in American history, men were tried and convicted not for what they had done, but for what they had said. Nobody knew who threw the bomb at Haymarket that resulted in such murder and mayhem, but in the trial that began on 21st of June, just over a month after the incident, 7 men were sentenced to death. Samuel Fielden, Louis Ling, A.R. Parson, August Spiess, Michael Schwab, Adolf Fischer, George Engel were all executed. The result of Haymarket was that the entire U.S. legal system and government were cast under suspicion as being no more than the tools of capitalism and industry. Around the world, those executed for Haymarket were viewed as martyrs, while the U.S. looked corrupt and a state run by businessmen for businessmen in which the common people had no voice. Haymarket also represents a classic American overreaction to terrorism. The cost of public safety came at the expense of liberty. Emma Goldman was born in Lithuania, in the Baltic, to a modest family. Her father was abusive and frequently beat his children. They spent part of her childhood then in the Russian Empire, but emigrated to Rochester, New York, in part to flee persecution of the Jewish community at the hands of the Russians. Emma Goldman's family were Orthodox Jews. In New York, Goldman took a job working in a dress factory, where she worked hard, long hours, and earned $2.50 a week. She soon quit, however, the hard life of the factory, and instead moved into a shop. There she met and married Jacob Kirshner, but after a year, they divorced. After her divorce, her family situation, which was always tense, deteriorated further. Emma was forced out of the house, and she moved to New York City with $5 in her pocket and her sewing machine in tow. There, at the Saks Cafe, she met Johann Most and Alexander Berkman. Johann Most, 1846 to 1906, was born out of wedlock to a clerk and a governess. He had an unhappy childhood. He was piteously abused by his stepmother, and as a child he suffered severe frostbite on the side of his face. The damaged area became infected and festered and decayed over the years. Doctors diagnosed this as terminal cancer when Most was still a boy. A surgeon operated and cut off half his face before badly sewing up the wound. At the hands of this butcher, Most was disfigured. He was therefore a disfigured, poor, and bastard child, a pariah in a society bound by convention. He became a militant atheist, and after apprenticing as a bookbinder, traveled from city to city in Europe. Most, during this time, learned of the militant socialism that was sweeping Europe in the 1860s and 70s. He became an eager disciple of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, whose work he summarized and published. He was a radical, anti-religious, anti-class, anti-patriotic preacher of terrorism. In 1874, while living in Germany, he was elected to a seat in the National Assembly, the Reichstag. While in office, a radical anarchist named Max Hodel attempted to assassinate Kaiser Wilhelm I, the German supreme hereditary leader. Like the Tsar, Kaiser in German means Caesar. On the 15th of August, Max Hodel was executed by beheading. Not long afterwards, Johann Most lost his seat in the Reichstag due to the public's backlash against anarchists. In 1880, Most was expelled from the Social Democratic Party for embracing anarchist beliefs. In 1881, Most was expelled from Germany, and like many political dissidents, he wound up in London. In June of 1881, though, his vocal support for the assassination of the Russian Tsar, Alexander II, led to Most's imprisonment at the hands of the English authorities for a year. After his release, Most emigrated to America, where he preached his creed of Marxism mixed with propaganda of the deed, urging revolutionary action and class awareness. The foremost among his disciples were Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. Thousands of union members of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers and the Carnegie Steel Company. Following a failure of collective bargaining and the reduction of wages and skilled workers in April of 1892, a move designed to create crisis by Henry Clay Frick, the steel mill manager and his boss, Andrew Carnegie locked workers out of the mill. Carnegie had barbed wire fences and sniper towers installed with searchlights and high-pressure water cannons. Now you might know Carnegie, the Carnegie name from things like Carnegie Hall, the famous Performing Arts Center, or Carnegie Mellon University, or from his charitable donations that founded hundreds of libraries around the country. But the Andrew Carnegie of 1892 was as ruthless a businessman as ever existed. He countered the threats of Union violence with his own calculated measures designed to create havoc among Union ranks, to break their unity, and to engender crisis. Working conditions in Carnegie's factories, as in factories everywhere, were deplorable. At Homestead, the workers called general strike. Frick, Carnegie's plant manager, hired hundreds of Pinkertons. When barges carrying the Pinkerton detectives arrived on the 6th of July, workers and townspeople met them on the banks of the Monongahela River. Shots rang out, and we'll never know who fired first, but a day-long firefight ensued between the Union men and the Pinkertons. The strikers attempted to sink the barge carrying the Pinkertons, firing shots at them, setting burning oil on fire in the river, and even using a 20-pound cannon. On the 6th of July, after failures to land and several exchanges of gunfire, things on the barges were in an impasse. On the 7th of July, the Pinkertons surrendered and were escorted under guard through a gauntlet of strikers. By mid-July, the Pennsylvania State Militia was called in by Pennsylvania Governor Pattison. Pattison was elected on behalf of Andrew Carnegie, an Andrew Carnegie-backed political machine, and his first concern was for the protection of the powerful Carnegie's assets. With the arrival of the Pennsylvania State Militia, the Union was dealt a severe blow. Strikebreakers were called in, a work camp was hastily constructed on the Homestead Steelworks grounds, where the strikebreakers could be fed and bunked, and the plant reopened under guard of the state militia, who posted 6,000 troops around the facility to break up the Union's actions. On the 23rd of July, as the crisis continued, with Frick, the plant manager, refusing talks with the Union until he felt enough chaos had been created for him to gain their total capitulation, Alexander Berkman entered Frick's office. Berkman, anarchist, editor, lover of Emma Goldman, and disciple of anarchist terrorism, terrorist Johann Most, tried to kill Frick. He shot Henry Clay Frick down, although Frick survived the attack. Berkman was taken away to prison. Frick recovered. The Union movement in America, though, was dealt a devastating setback by the actions of an anarchist terrorist. William McKinley was elected president in the aftermath of the crash of 1893. McKinley was a protectionist president. He was against free trade, in other words, and supported the defense of American industry through high tariffs on imported goods. McKinley was also the product of the Republican political machine and backed by powerful captains of industry, such as Rockefeller and Carnegie. He was re-elected to a second term in 1900, and there was no end in sight. McKinley was affable, accessible to the people, America was prospering, and despite his advanced age of 59, which was elderly for the day, he was healthy. Despite the fact that two presidents had been assassinated in the prior century, Abraham Lincoln, who'd been killed on the 14th of April, 1865, and James Garfield, assassinated on the 2nd of July, 1881, McKinley commonly refused a police escort. There was no Secret Service in existence, and Congress was divided as to how much and in what form protection of the president should constitute. At the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, McKinley delivered a speech, and then, as was customary, he began to shake hands of those wishing to greet the president. Among those in line was Leon Czolgosz, who carried concealed on his person a .32 caliber revolver. Czolgosz fired several shots, one of which passed through McKinley's body, another of which lodged inside and was never found. McKinley was a big man, and the doctors of his day were still working in many primitive ways. For example, hand washing and sterilization of instruments that were being practiced only by a handful of professionals in Europe were ridiculed by many American doctors. The new X-ray machine, which had just been invented and was on display at the Pan American Exposition where McKinley was shot, was missing certain parts that would have actually allowed it to function. Thus McKinley was victim not only of anarchist attack, but general incompetence, blundering, and the primitive practices of medicine of the day. He got gangrene and died early in the morning, September 14th, 1901, almost 8 days after the attack. Jogash, the anarchist, was convicted of murder and killed by electric chair in September 1901. Jogash refused to speak a word in his own defense, remarking only as he was strapped into the electric chair that he had killed, in McKinley, an enemy of the working class. Throughout the early 1900s, union versus capitalist and anarchist violence continued in the U.S. in sporadic cases. In almost all instances, the police intervened on behalf of capital. For their part, the unions were protesting the blacklisting of union members, unsafe working conditions, the lack of an 8-hour workday, intimidation, and the use of force on strikers. Anarchism in America took a particular turn as America entered World War I. Pressure continued to mount within American circles on anarchist practitioners and anarchist ideologues who responded with increasingly violent attacks against American institutions and symbols of American power. World War I was considered a wake-up call not only to America as a nation, uh, it was a harbinger for the massive modernization, the creation of a standing army, and was viewed by many anarchists as nothing more than a capitalist intervention in a war between imperialist powers. Accompanying our entry into the war were a series of increasingly repressive measures, many of them aimed at anarchists. For example, the Espionage Act of 1917 made it a crime to interfere with a war effort, to work with a hostile country, or to hinder in any way the conscription of individuals by the government. As you can see, this is an extremely expansive law which gave the United States government broad powers to intervene in the life of society. In response, November 24, 1917, a bomb in Milwaukee, Wisconsin was left at a Catholic church and resulted in the deaths of 9 policemen who had removed it to a local police station once the bomb had been discovered. This bomb, by the way, was apparently the work of Gallianisti anarchists who were eventually to be connected with Sakon Vanzetti, the film that you'll see this week. And this bomb maker was probably none other than Mario Buda or Mike Boda, the inventor of the car bomb, which is nicknamed Buda's Wagon. In 1918, further legislation in the form of the Immigration Act expanded on the Anarchist Exclusion Act of 1901 and gave the government even more leeway in dealing with aliens and foreign residents who were practitioners of anarchist thought and violence. It made possible the arrest and possible deportation of aliens and resident foreigners who were anarchists or who were affiliated with anarchists in any way. In 1915, Alexander Berkman had left New York and settled in San Francisco. There he founded in 1916 a new anarchist journal called The Blast. As World War I had broken out, both Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman led the fight against the draft. They led the No Conscription League and said, quote, "We oppose conscription because we are internationalists, anti-militarists, and opposed to all wars waged by capitalist governments," unquote. The entry then of the U.S. into the war was decisive for many American anarchists who viewed this decision as the ultimate display of the power of the wealthy in America. The banks and corporations owned by the wealthy would make millions of dollars, while the common people would bleed and die. The great banking houses of New York, J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers in particular, made millions of dollars, the equivalent of billions of dollars today, off the war. This was, according to their anarchist critics, blood money. In 1918, American labor activist Bill Haywood, who had been active in the International Workers of the World, nicknamed the Wobblies, and he had been linked in the West with many acts of union violence, particularly in the mining industry, had been tried and acquitted before, defended by the famous attorney Clarence Darrow, for example. Haywood was arrested along with 165 Wobblies in 1918 under these new laws passed by Woodrow Wilson's American government, and charged with, quote, conspiring to hinder the draft, encourage desertion, and intimidate others in connection with labor disputes, unquote, because Haywood and his colleagues were opposed to the U.S. entry and activities into the war. Haywood jumped bail and fled to Russia, where the communist Bolsheviks were fighting, of course, and winning the Civil War that would eventually lead to the rise of the Soviet Union. By his supporters, though, and those sympathetic with labor, Haywood was viewed as a scapegoat and an easy target of the U.S. government. He was someone, in other words, that the U.S. government had been sniping for decades and had never managed to actually pin down with anything. The Red Scare followed the end of the war in 1918. The following year, 1919, we entered a period of crisis in the United States where there was fear of contagion from Bolshevik activity and communism in Europe. In 1919, a leaflet called Plain Words was found at the site of explosions in Boston, New York, Paterson, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Washington. This anarchist pamphlet, called Plain Words, included the following text: "You have jailed, deported, and murdered us. We accept the challenge. The workers have the right to defend themselves, and since their presses have been silenced and their voices muzzled, we mean to speak for them with dynamite." Of course, this references the laws of 1917 and 18, which allowed for the sweeping arrest, closure of anarchist presses, and deportation of anarchist activists. "There will have to be bloodshed," the tract went on. "We will not dodge. There will have to be murder. We will kill because it is necessary. There will have to be destruction. We will destroy to rid the world of your tyrannical institutions. Long live social revolution. Down with tyranny." Signed, the anarchist fighters. This 1919 to 1920 Red Scare was mostly a mail bomb campaign, with parcels with explosives sent to high-profile enemies of the anarchist movement. Federal prosecutors, for example, politicians, and wealthy industrialists. 38 bombs were sent through the mail to politicians and capitalists, and this unrest was accompanied by general strikes in Seattle and the Boston police strike in September of 1919. On September 16, 1920, a car bomb was set off outside J.P. Morgan Bank on Wall Street, famously called the day that Wall Street exploded. This was followed by the Palmer raids by the federal government, in which the dragnet of the government swept up hundreds of suspected and accused anarchists. In 1919, the so-called Soviet Ark transported 249 Russian or anarchist sympathizers from the port of New York to Russia. Among those deported were Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman. The Red Scare of 1920, the Wall Street bombing, killed 38 people and wounded 300. It was probably the work of American anarchists, including Mario Buda, as a wagon bomb, so-called Buda's wagon, was used in the attack that blew off most of the front of the J.P. Morgan Bank building. And reaction among the American press and population was widespread and harsh. There was hysteria against foreigners, anarchists, and leftists. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which had given the government broad powers to detain and deport people, were used to gather up anyone who had a whiff of anarchism about them. Now, involved in these spates of violence were the so-called Gallianisti. Luigi Galliani, 1861 to 1931, emigrated to the U.S. in 1901. He was the founder of the Cronaca Sovversiva, the subversive chronicle, an anarchist agitator promoting propaganda of the deed. His disciples were implicated in various bombings throughout American cities in the 1910s and 20s. A rash of bombing attacks, of course, including the police station bombing that we mentioned in November 1917. The 1919 Red Scare bombing campaign was also a Gallianisti campaign, and this led to his deportation in the same year, 1919. He was sent back to Italy. Now, Sacco and Vanzetti, about whom you will watch the excellent documentary, were Italian immigrants. Nicola Sacco, 1891 to 1927, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, 1888 to 1927, were both Italian immigrants. Sacco, a shoemaker, a rather prosperous one, and Vanzetti, a laborer and a fishmonger. Both were associates of Luigi Galliani, famous in America for the group for the printing of his Cronaca Sovversiva, his subversive chronicle, and for his violent attacks on the institutions of American government and capitalism. It seems likely, maybe even virtually certain, that Sacco and Vanzetti at least knew of or somehow had some involvement in the bombings of 1919, that mail bombing campaign from which the Red Scare takes its name. They were arrested, however, for an April 15, 1920 attack in Braintree, 10 miles from Boston, in which the paymaster and security guard of a shoe manufacturing company were killed and the cash boxes containing $30,000 was stolen. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested on the 5th of May. The trial was polarizing and among the most political in history. Sacco and Vanzetti were both convicted and denied a retrial, even though Judge Thayer was on record as saying, "Did you see what I did to those anarchist bastards?" Thayer represented the pinnacle of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, so-called WASP society, was an anti-immigrant and bigoted judge, along with an all-white jury that would look down upon Italian immigrants and viewed them as troublemakers, at the least. As he went to his death, Sacco said, "We are proud for death and fall as anarchists can fall. It is up to you now, brothers and comrades." Vanzetti says, "If we have to die for a crime of which we are innocent, we ask for revenge in our names, and in the names of our living and dead." As you'll see in the film, the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti divided the country, created two martyrs for the labor movement, and probably resulted in the deaths of men who were not blameless, but who were almost certainly innocent of the crime for which they were accused and which they were tried and eventually executed. The trial of Sacco and Vanzetti galvanized the labor movement and underscored fundamental injustices in America. The problems with integrating immigrants, the problems with rampant capitalism, and the problems with an America that increasingly turned on the poor and the dispossessed, who it thought were threatening its security. The anarchist movement in America, as you can see, largely fueled by Italians or other Europeans, began to unravel in the 1930s. The Palmer raids, the Soviet arc, the deportation of large numbers of anarchists was in fact quite successful. But then in the 1930s, as many of the anarchists returned to Europe, they faced the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. And fascism, not capitalism, became their main target. So as anarchists aged, their movement declined and sank finally into obscurity in the 1940s and 1950s. The last representative of the Gallianisti movement, Raffaele Schiavina, died in 1987 and published his last book, La fine dell'anarchismo, in English in 1982, that urged a new generation that would battle until, quote, "the scourges of oppression, exploitation, and ignorance are erased from the face of the earth."